Okay. Again, this is Jeffrey Pearl with OTG Consulting. We're going to go ahead and get started. We've got a great topic here for you today. We're lucky to have Jack Danahy here with us. He is SVP of Security at AlertLogic. Jack engages with customers and the industry on product strategy. He has founded and co-founded 3 successful security companies, holding CEO and CTO roles. Most recently, he was CTO at Barkley and previously at Chiave Technologies, acquired by WatchGuard Technologies in 2000. At Ounce Labs, that was acquired by IBM, by the way, in 2009. He is frequently a writer and a speaker on security and security issues and has received multiple patents and a variety of security technologies. Prior to founding Barkley, Danahy was Director of Advanced Security for IBM and led delivery of security services for IBM in North America. So, Jack, thank you for joining here. I'm really excited about the topics. I know a lot of the people I've spoken to are excited about this. I know you have some great information to share here, so I appreciate you doing this for us today.
Absolutely, Jeff, and Liz, who's taking a little bit of time out of the day to hear about, sort of the development of what's happening in the wonderful world of risk and some of the impacts that sort of the broader acknowledgement and the higher participation in the dark web is bringing to people. For the audience's perspective, a lot of the reasons behind coming up with this presentation began with the discussion of why we see such an upswing, right, in the publicized attacks and why we see such a change in the nature of the attacks as they're happening. And a lot of it can be tracked back to the way that these crimes are perpetrated, how the bad folks learn about, how to make them actually happen, and the profitability. So we're going to be talking a lot about that today. We're going to talk about the impact that this has had, and we're also going to talk about some ways to think about making it a little bit better for yourself. For your own purposes, right, as the audience, I'd encourage you to take down the notes that you think are interesting. If you're listening to this, if you're watching it, number one, you're interested in the space. But number two, you may be trying to justify doing things differently, perhaps in your own organization, or doing more. And the more information you can have from third parties, and there's a lot of it in here, it can make those arguments more compelling and make your security journey a little bit more easy. So, when we start talking about that, right, that process of making the security journey easy, I just wanted to start off the top with the fact that this is no longer simply a discussion among those of us who operate in the technical community. Jeff was kind enough to mention, a lot of my background, even though I founded a few companies, is technical, right? And for a long time, the discussions about security were focused on technology, convincing people there was a technical risk, convincing people there was a technical solution. And what we see happening now is that the executive management suite recognizes that this is not just about the techies. The impacts of these problems affect them all the way down the line. And so just this first tidbit, it just shows you a little bit about the fact that upper-level management actually cares about this. So maybe some of you are attending because you want to be able to have that discussion, and I'm hoping we're going to give you the language to do that. And some of you may be responding to a request from a board or a set of execs who've come to it on their own, and they're asking you, how are you going to do it differently and what the real risk is? So that's what we're going to be talking about today, because both of those organizations, whether we're talking about the C-suite or whether we're talking about the board of directors, they really do lack that confidence, right? They don't feel comfortable that the organization is going to be able to resist these things, right? We're going to be able to rapidly recover from them. And so, we're going to be talking about how the nature of the changing threat and sort of the remuneration, right, the monetization of those threats is changing the way in which organizations have to worry about these types of problems. So let's dig in, right? There's all kinds of different attacks that affect organizations. Some of them are more or less prevalent at any given year or at any given time of year. But let's break it down. This is a great pickup that came via CISO magazine originally out of Trend. But it talks about 3 of these different kinds of attacks based on the way in which they're available to you, if you're a bad person, as a consumer, right, on the dark web. So if you think about what somebody's trying to do, right, a DDoS attack, we oftentimes think of these as being focused more on the sort of the gamer community, right? We see a lot of DDoS attacks happening when people are trying to throw other folks out of some competitive server, but we've also seen them focus on major financial institutions. I'll tell you, one of the quick examples of a DDoS attack in action was there was recently an attack, I'm going to say recently, probably 4 or 5 years ago, against one of the bigger banks that I was dealing with. And what ended up happening was there was a DDoS against the affected systems within an organization that was under attack. So what basically happened was, with the DDoS attack underway, all of that material aggressive technique, all that TTP, those were all hidden by the sheer volume of data. So we have to remember that, attacks like a DDoS, like this one that you can license off of the web, these services you can license off the web, sometimes they're not an end in and of themselves. It's not just meant to shut somebody down for a few hours. Sometimes they're like a cloak. They're hiding another form of attack within. But now this is a technology. Ordinarily, it would have required a lot of machines at scale to do this, that now you can pick up off the dark web. So what does this mean to us? Well, it means that you have to be watching for these kinds of attacks because they don't have to be as rare as they used to be, because they're no longer limited to organizations that have the size botnet, army that can do it. You can actually license this capability from others. But then let's talk about something that is a little less complicated, right, both to execute and in its purpose, but that we're seeing a lot more of, which is ransomware. So ransomware started, for those of you who are interested in the history of cybercrime, back in 1989. So it's been around for a long time. But around 2013, moving into 2016, it really accelerated, right? It accelerated to the point where we now see it pretty regularly. We see it being applied. And it's because the nature of the attacks became a lot more commoditized. There were some fairly standardized techniques that organizations could use. And in this case, where we're actually talking about what's available to attackers, from the commoditized sales portion of the dark web, you can actually go license on a monthly basis the capacity to execute your ransomware campaign. So not only has it gotten easier because of the commoditization of some of the tools, but it's become sort of much more straightforward by being able to go to organizations which will host the entire campaign as a service for you, allowing you to do the attacks and gather it. And we know the damage that these things cause, right? It is an enormous amount of availability concern, and for some organizations that don't have good backup strategies, good response strategies, who can't interrupt the attack mid-flow, it can really be catastrophic and almost existential for their organization. So there's two attacks that we've all heard a fair bit about. The third one, we hear less about, right? I mean, we hear about it happening, but there's less public focus on it because it's a little more complicated to understand. This is the theft of credentials, right? And this is something that is perhaps most understandably available to folks on the dark web, right? The capacity to go buy credentials which allow an individual user to log into an individual kind of account. In many cases, it can actually contain directly, the credentials necessary in terms of passwords, logons, what have you, to be able to take advantage of a system. Why is this so bad? Well, the main reason is that a lot of these attacks have a lot longer lifespan. If you read about fairly recent attacks where lots of credentials were stolen, you'll find that they were long-lived, right? These were advanced persistent threats. They lived on systems for a long time. They obfuscated their existence. They tried to remain invisible, and they exfiltrated lots and lots of credentials. And they behave that way, unlike a ransomware attack, which pretty much punches you in the face and says, I'm here, give me some money. A credential attack wants to live for a long time in obscurity, because then those credentials stay fresh and usable for a long time. And when one of the attackers has good creds, when they've picked up a set of creds, perhaps for a specific attack against an organization or against an individual, those creds can live for a long time. Suddenly they really do have keys to the kingdom, right? Whatever systems that user, that legitimate user has access to, now they have access to. And it allows a lot of initial attack vector success. It also allows for a lot of lateral spread where that individual account and their role allows them to spread laterally pretty quickly. And so I just want to bring this up to show there's a bit of variety available to folks who are looking for ways in which to attack others via the dark web. But there's also a different kind of damage that's caused by these different kinds of attacks. And as you're thinking about it, as you're executing on your own security strategies, you want to be thinking differently. All right, that DDoS flood me with traffic. I have to respond to that quickly in case they're using it as a cloak around another kind of attack. And I also want to get my systems back up and running. Ransomware, got to be watching for that, because it can actually bring down my systems. It can irretrievably damage data if I don't have good backup restoration resilience in play. And user credentials, man, I got to be watching out for that, because somebody can steal a credential and live for months, or years, exfiltrating data and taking advantage of systems and sort of, further perforating my systems. And thinking about all these things, they're now in the range of possibility for even modestly skilled attackers because of the fact that the dark web is making them available to them. And why are all these things having the success that they're having, right? And how are they becoming available? How are these attacks succeeding, and why are they being targeted this way? Well, it's because there's these two huge market shifts underway in tech in general, right? You'll see a lot of this described as digital transformation, right? Or the move to a user-centric network experience. But what it really means is that if you look back into the mid-1990s when the internet was young, people tried to balkanize themselves, right? They tried to separate things with relatively hard perimeters, creating, as I'm sure many of you have heard, the hard, crunchy outside, soft, chewy center model of security, where by protecting the outside, people felt, organizations felt, they had a fair degree of control over what was going to be able to come through the system and actually get access. Well, what's happened in the advent of a lot of shared services, the adoption of the cloud, hosting centers, in fact, tighter relationships and use of componentized services and microservices, we see that perimeter's gone, right? Any individual user will take their role and their authority and their access and permissions, and they'll run all over the place, right? They'll be heading in and out of the cloud. They'll be accessing applications on partner sites. They'll be doing a lot of different things which are existing well outside the perimeter. And so traditional models for security don't really work. They're not as clean as that anymore. And the technologies that are underway, right, that we use every day, sometimes we don't even see them, are a lot more varied. We're no longer touching monolithic applications, no longer logging into a network to get what we need. We're using these componentized bits of things which are optimized for performance or for scalability or for security in some cases, but they all link together. And for those of you who've been doing security for a long time, you know that it's in those gaps where a lot of the security concerns lie. So we've talked about all the information that the criminals gather and how they use it, but realize that the advancements of the technologies that are making us so much more flexible and so much more performant and scalable are actually some of the ways in which those attack vectors are being made more successful, as they're being applied in the wild. And it's only going to continue to grow. This is like my favorite chart. I came up with it a couple of years ago to talk about why the heck do attacks like ransomware grow so quickly? And this is something that I think that'll be useful for you guys as well as you're talking within your own teams. Realize that cybercrime is in many ways a perfect crime, right? So if you're a criminal on the street or you're a criminal on a computer, let's think about the three angles that you care about most, right? The first thing is you have to make money. Whether it's getting out of bed in the morning to go to work or getting out of bed in the evening to go attack someone, crime has to pay, right? So it's got to be profitable. We know, right, from looking at cyber attacks, and some of that information just gave you, just listed some of the prices, which are really inexpensive for these attack vectors, pretty damn profitable, right? So you're going to make some money. Second thing is simplicity. You don't want to have to go get your PhD to execute your crime, because if you could do that, you'd go get your PhD and be very successful doing something productive, right? So the attacks themselves, the crimes themselves have to be simple, not only so that more people can execute them and be successful with them, but so you're less likely to be caught. Right? Complex crimes get discovered much more easily, much more commonly than the very simple, straightforward crimes. And so a perfect crime is also very simple. And the third thing is you want it to be anonymous, right? No criminal wants to get caught. And it's actually the confluence of these three things that make cybercrime so popular and why we're going to continue to see advancements in techniques, because obviously it's profitable. It's simple, not only because the attacks themselves can be carried out using those commoditized components, but it can be relatively straightforward one-on-one kind of thing when it happens. And the use of like pseudo-anonymous cryptocurrencies, right? So I can't really track who's getting the money, where it's coming from, where it's going to. Well, that gives the anonymity that makes the criminals feel more comfortable. So you've got criminals looking for profitable crimes that are easy to run, where they're not going to get caught. And now we see why there's such a growth in both the techniques and the sophistication of these attacks, but also their profitability, and the converse of that, the losses that the victims are seeing. And, it's not getting any easier, right? So if you start thinking about one of the things that make these attacks successful is the really broad nature of the attack surface and the differing levels of security expertise that exist underneath it make it easier for folks to get in. Well, a move not just through digital transformation to the cloud, but to multi-cloud, right? So if you think about the security that one used to apply in a monolithic application or even a hosting center, traditional systems administration, configuration, network management, monitoring, pretty straightforward. Well, if I move to Cloud One, right, let's say it's AWS, fantastic platform, lots of infrastructure security, really much safer than folks could build on their own, but there's a shared responsibility model, right? And so I, as a customer, am now responsible for securing my data, and I was really good at it, when I had it on-prem, but now it's different, right? The questions are different, the tech is different, the concerns are different, access control is different, identity management is different, monitoring is different, scale is different. All of these things are different, so now I'm going to be thinking, well, all right, I got to do all this new stuff. You can hear it, right? You can hear it sort of opening up to the bad guys. And then perhaps what they say is, and I want to be multi-cloud, right? Because some of my stuff will be better in Azure. And so now they pop over to Azure, and guess what? Again, great infrastructure, great security for the basics, but shared responsibility. Now I've got a different set of that litany of things to be thinking about. And so as you start going through these checklists, you realize there's a lot of complexity that's involved when organizations are trying to make these moves to the benefit of the business, but it changes the nature of what they're doing in security, thereby sort of think of it as weakening that threat surface that the attackers are going to be looking for. And it creates a ton of complexity, right? And here's just some numbers and some tech, but the thing to remember is the main thing we're trying to say is that, a very, very thoughtful security person who decides to do the right thing and apply security rigor and wants to understand the different problems that they're going to see and the different vectors of threat that they're responsible for protecting against, it gets really complicated fast, not just in understanding the threat surface, but as this slide shows you, understanding the compensating controls, understanding the security mechanisms that they can use to prevent against it. How do you pick what to do first? How do you pick what's enough? And how do you understand how to weave these things together in a way that makes sense and it's actually systematic inside the organization? Because when you do it wrong, right, mistakes happen. So I will tell you, I have experience with Capital One, and it is a fantastic security company. They do a great job, right? And I think this is a great example to all of us about how one really has to think through all the implications of applying security in this much more diverse, much more heterogeneous environment. So 4 individually small mistakes, right? And this is all based on public reporting. You can pick this up anywhere. I have no inside information, none. This is all based on public reporting. So first off, a misconfigured WAF. The web application firewall, instead of blocking things which look threatening, blocking things that look like they're coming from bad places, was configured to learn about it, right? If you've configured a WAF before or had one trained, underneath you, you realize that for a while, you want it to watch stuff. I don't want to immediately be blasting everybody out. So it was misconfigured left that way so someone could get in. It allowed someone to get in to an internal application running on the internet that had a bug in it, right? That basically was vulnerable to a specific style of attack. And so it was this vulnerable app, hopefully protected on the inside of the network, but unfortunately exposed because of this misconfiguration. So here's 2 complete security challenges are on their own, right? Web application security management at firewall level, and how do I build really secure applications or mitigate the vulnerabilities when I find them. The third thing that happened was, and this is a big one, there was an over-permissioned IAM role. When you start working in the cloud, as I mentioned earlier, that user is really the thing that matters. And in this case, we're not even talking about a user per se, we're talking about what's called a role, right? So there was a role that existed on the server that was running that vulnerable application that had a lot more permissions than it needed to. And it happens all the time. If you take a look at the CIS benchmarks, the foundation benchmarks as an example for AWS, you'll find out there's a lot of checks in there to make sure that you're not accidentally over-permissioning, because when one of these things gets acquired, when one of these sets of user credentials, like we talked about earlier, gets breached, suddenly you can download the contents of over 600 different S3 buckets and steal all that private information. And as it's happening, right, because it's so broad, and my guess is it could have been just an internal or perhaps an underdevelopment service, there was insufficient monitoring, so there was no knowledge was being exfiltrated until it was found on the outside. So at some point in time between that internal network, such as it was, and the outside world, a whole passel of data was passing, right? And unfortunately, the monitoring wasn't set up to catch it. And who can really know why? Because we don't understand exactly what the application was doing or what the purpose of the network was. But these were 4 very understandable, very common kinds of mistakes. When you put them all together, because of that complexity we talked about and because of the accessibility of the threat and the tools, tens of millions of stolen credit card applications was the final result. And a really, really a black eye for a good company. And so just something to think about, the fact that, the combination of that complexity, the combination of the availability and commoditization and knowledge of these tools in the dark web, makes this a much more serious area of threat for folks as they go on. So, currently there's a couple of different ways that folks look to do this. Some folks try to do it themselves, right? And that's what the snowflake on the left is all about. I'm going to go try to figure out how can I create a security infrastructure that is unique and specifically tailored to my business. And it's really hard, right? Because you've got to not only pick out all the tools, you've got to figure out how they're going to play together, as I mentioned earlier, and you're going to have to make sure that you understand everything in the environment you want to have a look at, because a single blind spot can be pretty dangerous. And you've got to have somebody looking at it all the time, right? How do I find enough skilled people to run this? And so some people say, man, I can't do that, right? I'm going to jump. And for many years, there's been traditional, think of it as just security outsourcing, right? Where I grab some smart folks at an outside vendor and I say, listen, I've got all these tools. Can you please make them be security for me, right? Can you help me run security using these investments that I've made? And unfortunately, because these kinds of organizations tend to be trying to do things very broadly with a broad suite of tools, that's how they become most useful to their customers. They tend not to have a sufficient level of business context, or they tend not to have tailored the tech to talk natively to each other. And so what you can end up having is a lot of noise in the system, right? Or you can have escalations of events that don't have a lot of context, right? They say, listen, I can tell something's going wrong. I really don't get it because these tools aren't speaking well to each other here. And you get a pile of data to work your way through. And a lot of it's because of a lack of native tooling integration. So that's sort of some of the challenges that happen. And, one of the reasons why they continue to happen is because finding folks to do these jobs is brutal. Take either one of those two. How do I communicate as a customer to my vendors about what I'm looking for in terms of that DIY solution, or in terms of that managed solution that I have to sort of walk them through my business? And this isn't getting any easier, right? So at the same time, the dark web is making accessibility to hacker tools much more easily available to a broader and broader set of less and less trained people. Security is becoming harder and harder, and there are less and less people around to actually get it done. This is a serious challenge and a problem in this industry that I've been working in for 30 years. And it's having a real effect, right? The CSIS says from their survey that around 71% of the CIOs they surveyed believe that talent gap is causing damage to their organizations. And so some of you are probably on the phone nodding your head going, yes, no kidding, I've had that same rec open for about 8 months. Thank you very much, Jack. And when you think about it, right, there's multiple components to be able to do this. There is this capacity to do collection, to get all the data 24/7 that you need. When we talk about how do I figure out if something bad has happened, I have to get the data. How do I analyze the data, right? When you think about that volume of data, how do I create the tooling and the intelligence to be able to make sense of it? And once I have made sense of it, how do I validate that this actually matters, both that it's not a false positive and that it's particularly urgent or not urgent in the business context? Once I've got that together, then I've got to figure out how I'm going to report on it. Who does it go to? Who has to know? Can I simply report it into a system? Can I automate? Can I orchestrate? These are the steps that are necessary to think about handling these events as they happen. And then how do I respond, right? And just sort of as a really short side note, and perhaps we can do another webinar, Jeff, at another time, but that capacity for doing response, right, is a great opportunity for you all as security practitioners to be able to gather that information together and gather a team together prior to an event, right? Nothing is a better activator of people's interest in security than helping them to understand their role if things go sideways. When I know that I'm the person who has to get on the phone with the press, with the customers, with the executive committee, if something goes sideways, and even though I may be in marketing or sales or in legal, if I have a role to play, I promise they're going to get a lot more involved and be a lot more supportive of the security efforts when they understand the role they play. So again, just a quick side note, on the value of understanding response and on using it as a technique to communicate about security. So really quickly, as we sort of come to the end, I just wanted to talk about the combined capabilities that are really necessary to close the gap, right? And these are things that you can think about building internally. These are things that I think can be sort of complicated. The first off, make sure you can gather information from all those systems you need, right? So if you're going into the cloud, make sure you understand the cloud and gather information from either the native utilities or from other tools that are built on top of it. Don't forget, you still have people at home who are using computers in the office. Make sure you're gathering information there. Make sure you're gathering information at those junction points we talked about, the glue that bring these things together to see if people are trying to traverse it. try to make sure that you've got a good grasp of where all the information is and how to gather it and make sense of it. And then make sure you're also understanding what you should be looking for, right? We do a lot of work. I've done a lot of work over the years in understanding how threats changing, right? When there's a new attack, it can cause a new set of problems, right? It can cause a new set of openings for the bad guys to get through, which can really change the way you think about the dynamics of your security program, right? I'm going to have to watch for something different. I'm going to have to block something off that I didn't. I'm going to have to more aggressively update. So all these things are a result of having a great grasp of what's going on in terms of threat and vulnerability analysis. Apply the business context and the reality check to the data. So in the first place, we're gathering a ton of data right through that fabric. In the second place, you're gathering a lot of data about what you should be worried about and what it looks like in the wild. That third step, having those folks around, whether they're your own people or outsourced experts, make sure you have somebody who can make sense for it in the context of your own business. So what I've tried to do is give you guys a quick view of the way that the dark web and the commoditization and availability of attack tools is changing the nature of the threat that we see, and give you a couple of ideas for how to think about improving your own security over the course of time. Jeff, I'm hoping that there may be a couple of questions because we've got a couple of minutes left.
Yep. Hey, Jack. And for everybody else out there, I do have a few questions in there, but at the bottom of the screen, you can type a question. If you've got a question for Jack, he's seen, Jack, I don't know if you can ever say you've seen it all, but you've seen a lot of it, right? There's probably new things happening every day. But I do have a few questions here. So one, Jack, do you find that these types of attacks are more prominent in certain industries? Are there certain industries that get hit more than others?
Yeah, it's funny. We do see that, right? Meaning that there's more public awareness of it against industries where they're more successful. I think that isn't because of necessarily being targeted more. I think sometimes people see the correlation and read causation. I think that organizations which don't necessarily have the same level of investment or capacity to invest in security are victimized more than other organizations which may block these attacks out. And so we actually see it hitting and being really successful. This is the ransomware attacks, the credential thefts being applied against sort of the mid-sized to smaller company who doesn't necessarily have those multiple layers of security in place, which would allow some of the larger companies to block it off. The attacks themselves, Jeff, just to be clear, most of them are just going after a range of IP addresses. And if you make the mistake of being in that range of IP addresses, these automated bots are going to find you, they're going to find a vulnerability, and then they're going to try to take advantage of it.
Yeah, okay, interesting. And a couple questions here around ransomware. I'm going to kind of group them together. But so you've seen a lot of this out there, whether you've seen it personally or you've read about it. What is the average ransom request, and then what's the largest ever requested and / paid that you know of? Yeah, I mean, the very largest ones we're not going to know about, to be quite honest, because the people can afford to pay them are doing it so they don't have to report on it publicly. It used to be that you'd see it in Bitcoin / fraction of Bitcoin because there's this market sensitivity that ends up happening by the bad guys. They want to make it the most that they can get without having to ask the person to go look for more money outside. We do see some attacks which are going against local municipal authorities, those kinds of things, where the numbers can be relatively high in the tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars. We've seen publicly, millions made. I will tell you that it's really, really common to be in that $350 to $1,000 range. And one of the campaigns have done in the billions of dollars, which is horrible. But in only a small number of them, the companies who have been hit say, I got back everything and everything was just fine. And frankly, you never really know if they're completely off your systems because of the fact that, they got on there, they do their thing. It's easy to obfuscate yourself when you're on a corrupted system. So you can't really tell for sure that they're gone. So it's a really problematic space. Okay, and then real quick, if they've been hit, they pay the ransom. Could they be hit again? How often does that happen? We got about a minute and a half. Let's take the timing out here. Yeah, no worries. So, it happens. I think mainly because we can't pretend that ransomware is all done by one dude, right? Ransomware, these are multiple campaigns. We showed how on the dark web anybody can license the capability. So it could be coming from anywhere at any time. And so because of the fact you paid off criminal number one, it gives you absolutely zero likelihood that you'll be less likely to be hit by criminal number two who runs a similar scam. Right. So it might even pass you along to the next guy. It might even have a buddy. So then one other thing, because of these big dollars, I mean, I know some are pretty small, but there's large ones. Do you find that CFOs and larger corporations are interested in getting engaged with this? In other words, you're generally going into the CTO or CISO, but are folks out there that are talking to customers, are the CFOs interested? I imagine yes.
Yeah, a great CFO is very interested. A mediocre CFO is partially interested. A bad CFO thinks it's an IT problem, right? The CFO is ground zero for this. These are financial concerns. A lot of times the CFO has responsibility for things like compliance and auditable reporting. You get hit by one of these attacks with credential theft or a ransomware attack, and now you have to find a way to create an attestation that you know your financials are clean. Very, very difficult problem to solve. These are financial concerns. A lot of times the CFO has responsibility for things like compliance and auditable reporting. You get hit by one of these attacks with credential theft or a ransomware attack, and now you have to find a way to create an attestation that you know your financials are clean. Very, very difficult problem to solve.